Welcome to Sexpertease. I'm your host and favorite sexpert, Erica Rivera. Today, we're diving into a topic that impacts all of us, whether we realize it or not. How we understand intimacy, and more importantly, how often we misunderstand it. From cultural expectations to personal beliefs and past experiences, there are so many layers that shape how we approach relationships, connection, and even communication. And sometimes those influences can create confusion, mixed signals, or even disconnect in our relationships. Joining me today is John Cuturello, a counselor who specializes in trauma and relational dynamics. He brings a thoughtful and analytical perspective to the conversation around intimacy, particularly when it comes to how societal norms and personal responsibility intersect. In this episode, we're exploring society, shame, and the mixed signals that shape how people experience intimacy and what it actually takes to build something healthier and more self aware. So, John, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So I guess we'll just jump right into it. When people hear the word intimacy, what do you think they most commonly misunderstand about it?
I'd say there are a number of misconceptualizations, misunderstandings about intimacy, that some of which can be quite subtle, but there are two specifically that I believe can be most salient. The first would be that it's always focused on conventional or normative sexual intercourse, or penetrative sex as it might be called. Now, there's a reason that that misconceptualization exists. It's not entirely, to be fair, a misconceptualization. Our desire for intimacy or physical closeness to another person, usually of the opposite sex, given that most people are heterosexual in some, at least to a certain extent, it comes from the same underlying functioning as attraction, effectively sexual attraction. Nature wants us to reproduce in order to continue the species. At a basic level, that's how we were designed to work. But of course, as we've evolved as a species and become more civilized, we've learned that reproduction just on instinct is not a good idea. We don't want to simply reproduce indiscriminately. We want to be thoughtful. We want to consider that our reproductive habits and our actions do have consequences, and we need to be considerate of those consequences on other people as well as ourselves and on our eventual offspring, should they actualize. But people too often mistake that everything to do with intimacy, every intimate act, every intimate endeavor has to involve penetrative sex, or we may simply assume that anybody who wants intimacy eventually wants penetrative sex. But that's not always the case. Some people enjoy intimacy without penetrative sex. They love the experience of doing it with somebody they trust, and they love the emotional component of it. In fact, I'd say it's most healthy to do that when there is an emotional component, even if it does include normative sexual intercourse. It's most healthy to be involved with somebody about whom you personally care and want the best for. Some people simply enjoy the experience of being close to someone physically. And for many people, the emotionality has to come first. Otherwise, sexual intercourse doesn't feel comfortable for them. So really, I would say actually it's healthiest to think about sex not just as a need, but as a way of expressing very deep affection. And yes, there's no shame in having a particular need, but I'd say it's optimal when sex follows real emotional affection, real emotional closeness and care for somebody else. Because if you are invested in somebody in a way that takes commitment and takes a forethought on your part, you're much more likely to act in a way that is considerate and thoughtful, because mindsets relate to actions. So I'd say that you're also more likely to be thinking about what the other person's needs are and what the consequences of the interaction on them when you have a certain level of commitment to actually start as a basis. Something else that I would also say can be a misconception, although perhaps it's more subtle and less common, and there's also more nuance to it because it's not as unambiguous, is that some people who may not believe that sex and intimacy have to be inextricable from each other They may
Right.
also say that intimacy is simply another form of friendship. And for some people who may identify, for example, as asexual and aromantic, they may say, well, sex and intimacy or intimacy and friendship are effectively the same phenomenon. And I would say that as long as you are in a trusting relationship with someone, be it a friend or be it a romantic partner, as long as both of you know the boundaries and you enter into that relationship knowing what the scope is, then it's not an incorrect conceptualization, but I would say it could do with some more thought, because concepts and language exist as a means of delineating different experiences and different phenomena. And I wouldn't say that it's particularly useful psychologically for intimacy and friendship to be considered the same. Friendship and familial relations have a particular abstract quality whereby, yes, we may love someone, we may feel very close to them, we may have intense trust and care for that person, but intimacy has more of an evolutionary sexual basis. It involves a more visceral response whereby you feel certain arousal that you wouldn't feel towards somebody who is a friend or a member of a family.
Right.
And I'd say it's most psychologically useful to separate the two. And it doesn't mean, again, that either is more important than the other. It just means that knowing the different experiences psychologically helps to set boundaries about what's appropriate within the realms of those friendships.
Right. There's like a certain evolution or progress to that intimacy when you're romantically involved with someone versus a friendship, like you said. And there's also some that could argue, because I've also spoken to a lot of people that might be polyamorous and may think they could get their sexual satisfaction from a certain person, their emotional satisfaction from a different person, so it makes you wonder what intimacy looks like for someone in that dynamic, if there isn't that natural progression of, well, I care deeply about this person and it could lead to sexual intercourse. So so your answer kind of made me curious about that particular dynamic as well. So, how do you feel that societal norms or expectations shape the way people approach relationships, even without realizing it? Because there are a lot of societal norms.
I'll preface that discussion by stating that not all norms are bad inherently. There can be some resistance to norms, especially in present-day Western society, whereby we've acknowledged that there were bad norms in the past and that did cause harm to people. And all too often, the human mind reacts to extremity with extremity. So when we realized that norms had been used to harm people, often the reaction was to eliminate norms completely. But that's not good, because our minds do need structure and certain guiding principles. And essentially, societies are constituted by a large number of individual minds. So if we want something to function well on the societal level, there has to be norms at the individual level as well. So I'm not arguing that norms are bad. We do need norms, but there are such things as bad norms. Really, norms have evolved from effectively core psychological needs. So from a core standpoint, we have a need to have some certainty about what's acceptable in different situations and how we should conduct our lives. And without some guiding principle, then our minds effectively couldn't function. So all societies have norms in some way. And in relationships, the norms often cover matters such as if the members of a partnership are of opposite sex, who has what role and why? How should conflict be resolved? Should there be certain goals common to the relationship, such as certain types of traditional marriage, or should it be de facto? Should one have children? And there are norms regarding, in some societies, quite strongly in favour of having children. How should the various members of a couple run their household if they live together? Is cohabitation necessary or is it optional? If they're living together, how should they run the household? Should one person work and the other person take care of the household? Should it be shared? How should conflict be resolved? And should one person submit to the other, so to speak, which can have particular caveats associated with it? Should it be an equal process whereby both members of the partnership make decisions? And the problem is that there's an adaptive quality to having norms, in that when we have guidance as to how we should conduct our institutions, it reduces conflict, and it also does allow people to live more constructively, where their minds are not constantly preoccupied by trying to establish workings as they move through a particular endeavor. It's established for them. The problem is that norms also evolve from the same psychological tendency as one of our biggest weaknesses, that we don't really know how to think critically that often, and we're not taught it. And so all too often norms perpetuate because we have an evolutionary need to constantly know what we think the truth is and make a quick decision so that we can get on with life, and we don't question things. So I would say norms are important, and they should shape the way that we conduct ourselves. For example, there should be norms that it is absolutely wrong to engage in physical violence in relationships. It should be wrong to exploit people. It should be wrong to have sex without consent. Those are objectively things that we all need to have in place.
Absolutely.
And there certainly should be those norms. Beyond that, there may be norms that are perhaps more contentious about, for example, a wife being a homemaker and a man being the breadwinner. Those norms can be functional as long as all parties to it know exactly why it is they're doing what they're doing, and they have a knowledge of the mechanics of it. As long as everybody enters into these types of interactions, these types of endeavors with full knowledge, then those norms can actually help form quite healthy relationships, very constructive relationships from which beautiful things evolve. The problem is what most of society has, which is we don't really question them, and we don't know why they exist. And all too often explanations as to why they exist are informed by ideology, not logic. Mm-hmm. But if we inform things by logic, we can actually arrive at exactly the same conclusion as tradition, but informed and not ignorant of why those norms are taking place.
Right, right. That's such a good point, because I feel like nowadays so many people want to fight against societal norms and they don't want to follow tradition. But I feel like sometimes we can be so much on the other end of the spectrum when, like you said, some of these norms might actually be good for certain people. It may actually guide them in a healthy relationship. So I think it's great hearing that perspective as well, because I don't feel like we discuss that enough. I feel like there's a lot of discussions lately about going against societal norms at all costs, when really some of those norms might actually be good for certain relationships. So where do you see shame showing up most in how people experience or express intimacy?
Shame tends to show itself in instances in which a person may need something from a particular intimate interaction or an intimate relationship, but may not know how to ask for it. And that can derive from a number of different sources. Sometimes it may be societally induced, in which a person has observed a lot of media or a lot of norms being practiced in which sexual practices should be quite restricted, and that person has seen sexual practices be quite restricted and seen people effectively submit to sexual rules without question, and maybe they themselves have needs that are different from what is allowed by those norms, and they may feel as though if they were to ask for those needs to be met, then they may feel shame around it. Other people may have experienced trauma whereby they've been taught from a young age that their needs aren't important, and they've been emotionally neglected, and they've learned that if they ask for their needs to be met, that they'll suffer consequences. And so they may feel ashamed for having those needs. And that can be regarding a variety of different matters. It could be as simple as them wanting to know that their partner is actually attracted to them, because we do have an innate need to want to feel loved and admired by somebody close to us. It may be wanting to know that their partner recognizes what they like or dislike during intimacy, and knowing that their partner is going to avoid what they dislike and do what they like. It may be needing certain sentiments on a daily basis, like being shown affection by their partner, just to remind them that they are a unit and that they very much love each other. And sometimes there can also be a more subtle form of, I won't say it's a more subtle form of shame, but shame with some more nuance associated with it, where people might want to try sexually exotic practices like kink or BDSM, and they may be drawn to that and may feel as though they might be ostracized by their partner if they ask to try those activities. Now, the reason I'd say there's more nuance associated with this is because the shame there, I wouldn't say it's inherently good. I'd say there's an evolutionary reason why we might feel uncomfortable around those matters. It's more because there are risks associated with them that aren't associated with traditional relationships. So the shame is probably born of an evolutionary mechanism of our mind trying to protect us from being too adventurous and potentially doing something that could harm ourselves or our partner. And statistically speaking, there are more risks involved in certain BDSM activities than there are in conventional relational dynamics. But I'd say that in those circumstances, the way that I would look at that type of shame, that specific type of shame, is to say those sorts of endeavors do have risks associated with them. Just if you're going to enter into them, know what the risks are, but ultimately you as an adult have the choice. There may be risks, but it doesn't make you a bad person if you take those risks with consent. It just means that you're perhaps, so to speak, flirting with the boundaries of what our minds conventionally handled. And if you do see those risks start to actualize, know how to stop the risk from escalating so that it doesn't become a danger to anyone. But in a lot of other forms of shame, we work with that by identifying what the need is and then creating an environment where someone can ask for those needs to be met and can observe somebody actually caring about it.
Right, right. And one should really feel comfortable asking those needs from their partner. And I do agree, especially with the kink side of things, making sure that you're educated in whatever need or whatever curiosity that you're looking into. That education is so important, especially for safety reasons. Now, in your work, what are some common mixed signals people send or receive in relationships that create confusion or disconnect?
The first type of mixed signal, which is quite a major one, is what might be termed approach avoidance conflict, or conflict between approach and avoidance. And this is what happens in a situation in which one partner behaves in a way that suggests to the other that they need a certain type of affectionate intimacy. But then when the other partner tries to meet that need, the other person is repulsed by it or becomes reactive to it. And the most common reason for this is through emotional trauma or emotional neglect. And this is what happens when a child has grown up in an environment in which they did not readily observe their caregivers tending to their emotional needs and showing them how to regulate their emotions. And then when they become an adult, because they haven't learned those needs from a young age, it's hard for them to cope with emotionally charged situations. And there are a number of different emotionally charged situations present in that type of conflict. One of them is not having one's needs met. That becomes very emotionally charged, and the way they react to it is by aggressively asking for those needs to be met. Then the other emotionally charged situation is actually receiving the experience of having those needs met, or at least the partner trying to meet those needs, in which case it becomes so overwhelming that the person effectively becomes frightened and repels themselves or recoils because they're concerned about what might happen following that instance. Now, in very extreme cases, that can be a part of a diagnosis of, say, complex post-traumatic stress disorder or even borderline personality disorder, which is a term that can have some misunderstandings associated with it. But quite often that is the type of mixed signal where both partners aren't quite aware of how their own personal behaviors, which may be unconscious, they may be unconsciously choosing those behaviors, contribute to the situation. So the way that we often overcome that is by developing insight and then developing very specific, safe intimacy practices whereby a person can become accustomed to facing those emotionally charged situations and observing their needs being met so they start to feel safer. There's another type of mixed signal that I find quite often it's more affiliated with dating. And it's the phenomenon in which a person might be dating and somebody they meet says, I'm ready for a serious relationship, but their behavior doesn't match that sentiment. So, for example, they might ghost, or they might take 2 weeks to reply to messages if you're communicating online, which that ethos is not consistent with a person who wants a serious relationship. It might be, for example, that a person says, I want a serious relationship that's marked by emotional closeness and safety, but the first interactions that they want are sexual intimacy, like physical intimacy. Right. Physical intimacy is important, but if you're prioritizing that over the emotional aspect, it can also be effectively your mind's way of, it can be a form of cognitive dissonance in which your mind says, well, I really just want the sexual intimacy, but it's more likely that this person will want to give me that sexual intimacy if I tell them that I want a serious relationship. So I'll just tell them whatever they want to hear and make that happen, which is a form of exploitation. And there's other signals as well. For example, I've heard a lot of instances of people asking to date someone, saying, well, I really want a serious relationship, but I don't know when I'm going to have the time for it. Well, if you don't know when you're going to have the time for it, don't keep people waiting. You get yourself ready first, then seek someone. Or otherwise just behaving in a manner that suggests they don't have the emotional or temporal capacity to give somebody else emotional care. And all too often it results in someone who's very willing to give and the other person effectively feeding off that care without giving anything in return. Which is something that I've touched on it before. I'll probably explore it more in the future, but this is a dating pattern that we as a society really have to break because it hurts people, and it's not good for us as individuals if we practice it, because what we're effectively learning to do is say, my needs are important, but other people are also just, I'm entitled to other people meeting my needs, but other people aren't entitled to me giving a piece of myself. So
I feel like
mixed signals.
I feel like that's definitely becoming more common, especially with the rise of like situationships, and it kind of went around full circle because earlier when I asked about intimacy and those who pursue just the physical, as opposed to having the emotion evolve into something physical, this kind of brought it to my attention. But yeah, situationships are huge. I almost feel like you're going to see that more often. I feel like you're not going to stop seeing that for a while, or at least even in my office, I feel like I see this a lot, where that mixed signal of, yes, I want I want a serious relationship, but they're always waiting for like perhaps the next best thing or the next person who could maybe fulfill certain needs better. Or it's almost like our generation right now is never truly satisfied, so they're always looking for that next high, so to speak, almost. So would you agree with that sentiment?
We have become too accustomed to hedonistic thinking and experiences, which the psychology of that, I don't want to be a virtue signaler, because there are certain ideologues who say that anything that's pleasurable is somehow wrong. But if your mind is so focused on pleasure that it forgets that the world has practical limitations, then you're not going to enjoy life very much, and you're probably going to face problems in that. So it's important to at least know what the boundaries of pleasure are.
Yeah, and like you said, it hurts other people. In the long run, we're kind of just hurting each other. So really, that's not a good consequence to having that attitude. So how would you say, how would you balance encouraging open-minded thinking around intimacy while still emphasizing personal responsibility and emotional impact in relationships? This is actually a great segue to that.
To establish that, it needs to actually start well before you form any relationship with someone. You need to have an establishment of what your own standards and needs are. So knowing what intimacy is for you, does it involve conventional sexual intercourse? Is there certain emotional qualities to it? Does it have to evolve into something like marriage or cohabitation or starting a family? Or can it be exclusive of those endeavors? What are your needs during intimacy? Are there certain practices that are completely unacceptable to you? Are there certain practices that you may like to try? What sort of sentiments do you need your partner to express? What sort of efforts do you need your partner to exert for you? And what efforts are you willing to spend for your partner? You need to know that right from the start. That adage that you can't be happy in a relationship unless you're happy with yourself can be double talk at times, but in this case it's apropos, because you need to know what you can contribute, because your partner is going to have needs and you can't simply expect them to meet your needs without meeting theirs. So know what you can give and know what your needs are. And when you're dating, be honest about it. That online dating doesn't have as many benefits as I think people posit. But one of the major benefits is that when people read your profile, if you've taken the time to write it properly, they can see what your expectations are. And so people don't, if you are honest about it and you have the right intentions, other people have no reason, no excuse not to know what your needs are. You can state right from the start, this is the type of relationship I want, these are my needs. Have open conversations about it with the person you're dating. Be honest from the start, this is what I need from intimacy. And throughout the relationship, have an understanding of the fact that often conflict or turbulence arises when both people have acted in a certain way, often unintentionally and through no fault of their own, but have unintentionally contributed to that turbulence. Develop self-awareness, know how your communication patterns contribute to the turbulence. Learn with your partner, not separate from, but with your partner, how to diffuse that turbulence. And using that diffusal of turbulence, know how to communicate in order to resolve conflict.
Right, right. Even, I mean, you mentioned online dating, but even organically, I feel that, that first date, just be honest from the start. Like, why? Sometimes I don't understand waiting to kind of talk about some of those expectations later because, I would just rather put it all on the table now, have it all out there now in the same way that you would have it like on a dating profile. But that's just me. That's just me. But for someone who might be listening that feels stuck currently or disconnected from their relationship, what's one mindset shift that they can start practicing right away?
The major mindset shift is to stop seeking quick wisdom and quick answers and be willing to commit to long-term effort in your change. So I'm rather blunt about this, and not everyone agrees with it, but I'd say avoid content regarding intimacy and dating on social media. Avoid people who claim to be life coaches who have the one framework for a healthy four-figure sum. It's going to solve all your problems. This is a grift. Like, avoid it completely. What you need to do is define what is it that's stuck. Define it in the most simple possible terms. Once you've defined it in the most simple possible terms, understand what is it that's stopping that stuckness from moving. Is it my communicative patterns? Is it my partner's? Is it the dynamic that we have? Is it something else, some other influence that's impacting the relationship? Define what the barrier is, and then define what is it going to help you change that. And like I'm not anti-coaching, but a good coach will tell you there is no quick answer and there is no secret. It's basic psychological problem solving works in basically every situation. You need to have an awareness of what is actually wrong. If you need help defining that, a good coach or therapist can help you do that. And what they'll also do is they'll help you to develop it not just as a solution to a problem, but a process that then you can use in the future and become a more independent relational problem solver. But when you feel stuck, identify the barrier and go back to the basic process of identifying what is it that's actually preventing change and what can you do to overcome that barrier.
And you're so right. That process normally takes time in the same way that there isn't a get rich quick scheme out there. I do see a lot of coaches that claim to have that secret for a relationship to be all new. And like you said, it's time. It takes time. It takes effort. So thank you so much for being here. Please tell our audience where we can find you, what things you have coming up in your life.
Well, thank you, Erica. It's been a pleasure to be here. You can find me online at www.yourlistener.com.au. If you're in Australia and are seeking counselling, you can contact me that way. And I also on my website have links to the Your Listener podcast where I discuss psychology and teach people how our minds work, talk about how we can be more critical consumers of information. I always have a new episode being published usually on a weekly basis at the moment. I talk about all manner of subjects, and I have a number of exciting guests pending for collaborative episodes, and very much looking forward in the future to just continuing meeting different people with different views and teaching our audience about how our minds work.
Fantastic. I love it. Definitely check John out. Make sure to listen to his podcast as well. And as usual, please stay safe, stay intentional, and stay curious. We will see you next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much, John. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Erica.